Welcome to another Chapter podcast with your hosts, Claire and Rebecca. Welcome to Season 2, Chapter 9 of Another Chapter, the podcast. And in this episode, we caught up with the wonderful and hilarious Carmel Harrington. So, Rebecca, what did you enjoy the most about our chat with Carmel?
She is fascinating, absolutely fascinating. At one point during the interview, you will hear me asking her, would she ever consider writing a book about her own life? Because the stories we were getting about her background, from writing, her family, all of these things were absolutely fascinating. There was a couple of times that our jaws literally dropped as we were listening to her stories.
Absolutely. And something that kind of stood out to me was just how natural storytelling is for her. She is an enthralling person to have a conversation with.
So today we have a wonderful guest chatting to us. Carmel Harrington is an international bestseller from Wexford, where she lives with her husband, children and rescue dog, George Bailey. Her latest novel, The Lighthouse Secret, was an instant Irish Times bestseller. Carmel's debut was a multi-award-winning novel, and several books have been shortlisted for an Irish Book Award. She is a regular on Irish TV screens and radio and has been a guest speaker at literary events in Ireland, the UK and the USA. She was also chair of the Wexford Literary Festival for 3 years. A storyteller with heart and emotion, Carmel's trademark is to write domestic dramas about the dark and light sides of life, with relatable characters and twisting plots. Her novels, including The Girl From Donegal, A Mother's Heart and The Moon Over Kilmore Quay, have been Irish Times, Sunday Times, USA Today and Amazon bestsellers. You can find her on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram at Happy Mrs. H, all one word. So that is a very impressive bio, Carmel.
Thank you. When you read it like that, it kind of sounds a bit all right, doesn't it, really? But when you're living that,
it does. It very much does.
Yeah. It's been a busy 12 years, one book a year.
12 books is amazing, really, isn't it? As we went to an event and we saw you in Cork City Library, and you were saying that you write a book a year, which is mind-blowing for any of us mere mortals that could never even comprehend being able to manage that. Yeah, and it's a great, you've got a great system. Do you want to talk us through your kind of yearly plan?
Well, yeah, no, I'd love to. Well, it's my full-time job. I suppose that's first and foremost, is that, and it is a job to me. While it is my passion, and while books have been my passion, which I know we're going to get into when we start talking about favourite books, but books have been my passion my entire life. So I feel very, very privileged and lucky to do what I do, but it is a job. At the end of the day, I write books because I want to be paid and I want to be able to put my kids through university in a few years' time. You know what I mean? So it is a job. So I have to show up every day for that purpose. But what I've managed to do over the years is I've managed to kind of align my working year with the kids' school year. So really at the beginning, the 1st of September, when the kids go back to school, is when I start a new book. And I get a new notebook and I open up a new document on my desktop and I start writing, and I will write the first draft of that book right up until around Easter time. And then I will send it off to my publisher. And then between Easter, then I'll take Easter off. And then between Easter and the school holidays for the kids, that's when I do all my edits. So there will be 3 or 4 different versions of that book completed with edits from my publisher, and I'll work on all of that. And then I try to always take a month off during the summer. So when the kids are off in the summer, I'll take a month off and do all the kind of bits and pieces with them. But I'm kind of writing in my head at that stage as well, because I'm thinking about what I'm going to do on the 1st of September, and then it starts all over again. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, I will be publishing a book too. And as you mentioned, you came to see me speak in Cork. Well, that was just one of many events. So for about 6 weeks, I'm just literally at the other end of it. But for about 6 weeks around publication, I'm pretty much doing something nearly every day, at least every couple of days. So it can be quite busy. But I do take as well as the month in the summer, I always take a month off of Christmas. So I take kind of the last 2 weeks in December, first 2 weeks in January off. So while I do work hard, I play hard. You know, I make sure I have plenty of downtime as well. But that's how my schedule works.
That just sounds like organized chaos, really, isn't it? Like, Joe, you've got so much going on, considering that you're technically working on 2 books at any given time, like getting one published and promoted. Yeah. And then in the middle of writing another. I personally don't understand how authors don't get confused. Do you know, like at a Q&A or anything? Like, I think I'd start talking about the book that I'd be currently writing and be giving away plot lines and everything.
I think it has to happen. Yeah. It will at some point, because I do kind of liken it. Do you ever, you know, if you're working on your desktop and you have too many tabs open and then it starts slowing down and you've got, oh, how did I end up with 12 tabs open? I need to kind of shut some of these down. And that's kind of what happens. And I think for me, now that I've hit, you know, book, and in fact, I've written 13 books, 12 have been published, but I've just finished writing book 13. So I've had to kind of lose. And sometimes somebody will say something to me about an earlier book and I'll have to take a second to kind of go, oh, who was it? What was that? You know what I mean? And it does take me a beat. So you tend to kind of remember the most recent 4 or 5, I think. And it's impossible. And then you will remember, I don't mean you don't, I remember the main characters and of course the storyline, but I can be sometimes surprised. Somebody sent me a message there recently about the second book I wrote, and they mentioned a very, very minor character. I hadn't a clue who they were talking about. And they were asking me a question about a plot, and they were saying, you know, I'm really dying to know whatever happened. And I said, you know, I'd like to know. I have no clue what you're talking about. And I had to go and I had to literally open up the book and flick through. And then I went, oh yeah, her, you know. And it was kind of funny. And I think that's what happens.
Yeah. It's such a brilliant system though. Like, even you talking there about like opening up a new document, opening up a new notebook. Like, there's something very pleasing about that thought, that it's literally a clean slate.
Yeah.
Like, when you started writing, did you anticipate that it was going to be this kind of format or like this schedule, or what? Like, I assume it took a lot longer at the beginning to write books?
I hadn't a clue what I was doing, Rebecca. I swear to God, I made it up as I went along. And I do feel that my first 3 to 4 books were like an apprenticeship. And I was very much, you know, I was learning how to sort out the U-bend. I had no clue what I was doing. I was doing this apprenticeship and I was making it up, asking questions and trying to learn as much on the go as I could. But when I started out, when I got my first book deal, I had 2 books written. So the first book deal was for 2 books. And I actually had both books written. So it kind of gave me, because I had been trying to get a book deal for a little bit. So that gave me a little bit of a head start. So while I've published one book a year for the first 12 years, I actually had 2 of those written, if you like, 14 years ago, if that makes sense. And it's only over the last, I think it's now 5 books that we've settled on this kind of early spring timeline. And it just works beautifully for me. And I think that it's like everything. The more successful you are, the more kind of power it gives you. And you can ask questions like, so now I kind of say to my publisher, I need to make sure that I fit my edits and everything around family life, because like the most important thing to me is my family, my husband and kids. And that's first and foremost. And this is a job, as I said. I love my job, but it's a job. So they come first. So I have to make sure that I can still be the mother that I want to be and the wife that I want to be, you know, as well as being the author that I want to be. So it's kind of worked out. But I kind of, as I said, I work hard and play hard. So it works well for our family. It works well now. But it took a beat to get there. It wasn't easy sailing. It was a bit of maneuvering.
That's very impressive. And like, I really admire that you put your family first. I know how hard it is. We know how difficult it is. You can get absolutely consumed by your job. And particularly when your job is like creating other people fictionally and stuff, like that has to be quite consuming. Can I ask you a question? Again, I'm kind of reverting back to what you were discussing at the Cork City Library, but you spoke about how you basically got the courage to approach a publisher, and you said that you were looking at your daughter and you wanted the best for her and you wanted her to be able to achieve anything that she wanted. And at that moment, you kind of realized that you felt like a bit of a fraud because you weren't following your own dreams. Can you talk to our listeners a little bit more about that? Because I think that was a really gorgeous story, and it really resonated with me anyway.
Oh, thank you.
I think it's beautiful.
Thank you. Well, I mean, it's all true, because I literally was in my way for years. When I met my husband, and I didn't meet my husband until I was 35, I've always been a little bit slow to the party. I was kind of the last to arrive. But by the time I met Rog, I'd already written the first book, which became Beyond Grace's Rainbow, but I showed it to nobody. It was literally in a pretty folder, and I had it under my bed. And I told him fairly early on in our relationship, I kind of confessed to him that I wanted to kind of pursue this career as an author, but I wasn't quite sure if I was brave enough to do it. And so he would say it to me every kind of couple of months. He'd bring it up. And then when I started to write the second book then shortly after we got married, and I had 2 books finished, as I said, when my daughter was born. And I was on maternity leave because I was quite a senior, I was a sales and marketing manager for an American multinational. And it was a fairly full-on job with an expense account, a company car. I mean, jeepers, it was a very different life, really. But I didn't enjoy it. I was good at it, but I didn't enjoy it. And I was on maternity leave, and exactly as Claire shared, I was looking at my daughter. I just put her to sleep, and she had, when they're very small, and you both know that she has smaller kids now than I do, but she was asleep with her hands above her head, and she was just so peaceful and looked so beautiful. And I was so charmed with myself that I had finally managed to have this beautiful baby, because I'd wanted to have a child for so long. And I was so charmed. And I remember looking at her, and just literally that thought went through my mind, like, what will your special talents be? What will your dreams and hopes be for the future? And I promise you, whatever they are, I am going to do everything in my power to help you achieve those. And I will be your biggest cheerleader. And I was saying this to her as she was sleeping. And then it just struck me. I am the biggest fraud ever, because I had wanted to be an author my entire life. And I had, at this stage, 2 books printed out in pretty folders under my bed. And I had been too scared. It wasn't that I had been rejected at that point. I hadn't allowed myself to be rejected because I hadn't been brave enough to tell anyone, this is who I am. This is who I want to be. So I went out to my husband, and it really was for Amelia. I thought, I need to lead by example. So I went out to my husband, and I said, I think I'm going to go and I'm going to try and get this book published. And I just always remember it. He just got up and he said, I better open a bottle of wine. So we opened a bottle of wine. I was still nice, which we wouldn't really do. But we had a bottle of wine, and we sat there and we kind of talked about it. And then it was like, what the hell are we going to do? And of course, I had no clue what to do, because I knew nobody in the industry. So even the fact that I'd said that out loud, I then had to try and work out how to do it. But yeah, it was, and I hope now that my daughter knows that story. She's heard me kind of sharing it before. But I would say to both my kids, to Amelia and Nate, quite often, say that you have to fearlessly chase your dreams, and you can't necessarily, you're not going to achieve all of them, but you're going to get some of them, and you certainly won't achieve them if you don't try. And I think it's really important to fearlessly chase them, really. Yeah.
That story just makes me so emotional, because I think like we can totally relate to looking at our babies and, wanting nothing but the best for them. And I just think it's amazing that you did it and you took the plunge.
Yeah, so, thank you.
It served you well, to be fair.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. And it isn't easy, is it? Like, you guys know this, to be working mamas, and it's hard to juggle it all and to kind of do it all. And, when I started, I literally was like Amelia say would have been about 6 months old at that point. And then because we knew we wanted more than one, and because I was 40 when I had Amelia, we couldn't be hanging around. Like, it was kind of like we kind of get going again. So I had 2 under 2, you know what I mean? I had 2 babies under 2. So when I made that kind of big decision, I think I'm going to do this, I was actively trying to change my career, this huge life-changing moment in my life with 2 babies under 2. So I was really busy, I can remember, and I'll tell you, and it wasn't always easy. I remember I had been looking for an agent, and I had started with the Irish agents, and this particular literary agent in Ireland, I had sent him sample chapters of Beyond Grace's Rainbow, and he phoned me just as I was doing I was about to feed. Nate had been born at this stage. I had a newborn, and I also had, as I said, Amelia, and I was just about to feed Nate. And Amelia was kind of cutting up. She was, and I remember saying to him, can I call you back in 20 minutes? And I thought, I'll get my mum, who lives down the road. She can come take over, and then I can ring him. And he said, if you can't push this ahead of, this is more important. If you're saying to me, you cannot take this call with me now. And I was like, I can't. I said, I can call you and give you my full attention in 20 minutes. Just give me 20 minutes, because the kids were crying. I thought, what did he want me to do? Leave them in a room and let them cry it out, But I remember putting down the phone and thinking, well, this won't work for me, because I never called him back, because I thought, if he cannot appreciate that I'm a mother first, and I was always going to be a mother first. So he kind of went, and I thought, that's the end of him. And that was probably the right thing, because I eventually found the right agent. Do you know what I mean? But it wasn't easy at first. It was a few knockbacks before we got where we needed to go, But that was my kind of first interaction with an agent. And I thought, oh God, now this is really not going to work out. We're going to go from here. But thankfully, I'm my agent now. I have the most gorgeous agent, and she's actually a single mom, and she really gets it, because she's a single mom. So we have, it's amazing. Oh my God, we've become such good friends as well. She understands what it's like to have that juggle struggle. So that's great.
And so was getting the agent the first thing? So did you decide to find an agent first? So you sent nothing out, we'll say, other than to the agents in terms of getting the book out there?
I tried to get an agent first, and I had 47 rejections. So it didn't go very well. I just kept going. And at that stage for me, and this was, bearing in mind, this was 2010, 2011, that kind of time frame. And it's very different now. It's all, you can do digital submissions, so it can all be done through email. But for me, it was like printing it out and posting it. Most people wouldn't take email submissions. So I had bought the Writer's Year handbooks. If any of your listeners are writers, that's kind of still, it's printed every year with a new update of all the agents and publishers in Ireland, the UK and America. And so I bought a copy of that, and it's like a Bible. It's huge, and I had a highlighter, and I go through them literally one by one. And then when I got a no, I cross it out and go to the next. So it was a slow process, but I kept at it. But back then as well, you weren't supposed to contact more than one at a time. It's changed now. It's now assumed. You just say to them, I'm actively submitting to several agents. Whereas then you had to apply to one. And then if they said no, then you went to the next. So it was a different kind of system than it is now. And I really, I was getting nowhere fast. So on the 47th, I can still remember the 47th rejection. And not all of them were rejections, as in that I got a letter back. Some of them just ignored me and I didn't hear from them. And I count that as a rejection because they just ignored me. And I'd give them, they would say on their submissions kind of format in this yearbook, if you haven't heard back within 6 weeks, you're not going to hear back, So it was slow. Some would come back quickly. So quick, you kind of felt like they probably didn't read your work. But it went on and went on. And then E.L. James had just published, self-published, what is it called? 50 Shades. And a friend of mine, one of the few friends who knew that I had written books, because I didn't tell anybody. And she sent me a link. It mustn't have been a link, 2012, but she sent me anyhow a screenshot maybe of an article in one of the supplements talking about E.L. James, how she'd self-published this book. So anyhow, I just decided, I thought, well, maybe I need something to get an agent to notice me, because at the minute I'm getting nowhere. So I decided to self-publish as an ebook only, Beyond Grace's Rainbow. And I had no interest in self-publishing and having like boxes of books under my stairs, so that if somebody came over to the house, would you like to see my book? And I just did not want to do that. I was mortified for myself that I have to try and sell it, So I thought, if I do ebook only, I can tell nobody. I'll just do it. And this is no word of a lie, girls. So I found out how to do that, and I'm, I'm fairly computer savvy anyhow. So I worked it out fairly quickly, and it wasn't a huge amount of money, because at this stage I had quit my job to become a writer, and it wasn't going very well. So we talked it over with my husband, and with little investment, because it was ebook only, we weren't paying for loads of print books that mightn't sell, So published it, but I didn't tell anyone. Again, I told nobody. And it was one of those books. So Beyond Grace's Rainbow, self-published version, the first version I wrote, self-edited, think about it. And I created on my iPad, I created the cover of my iPad myself. It was a blue Peter job, literally a blue Peter job. But I self-published it and it went to number 1 on Amazon. Like it literally went to number 1. And I couldn't believe it. Yeah, and no, I told nobody. And
That's
the thing was,
incredible.
Yeah, right, I know, I couldn't believe it. And a friend of mine who lives down in Cavan, and I remember she rang me and she was like, I'm here on Apple iBooks. She's an e-reader. And she said, like, and there's an author from Carmel Harrington who's written a book. I couldn't believe it. It says she's from Wexford in the bio, I was like, that's me. And she was like, that's you. It was so funny. She goes, you don't say that. So she outed me. She went on to Facebook then, back when Facebook was a cool place to be. And she kind of said, oh my God, look, Carmel Harrington is. So everybody then started sharing it. So it kind of took off. And I can remember my mother ringing me and saying to me, really shocked, that her friend who lives in Donegal had been at the hairdressers and they were talking about my book in the hairdressers. And my mother was saying, they don't know who you are, but they're still talking about your book. So that's how I got my agent. And within 3 months of that book going to number 1, I had found an agent who had found me a book deal with HarperCollins. So we took the ebook off the platforms, and then HarperCollins republished it. So it was republished then a few months later, with their backing. They edited it and published it. And I think that when people read it, because it's not a perfect book, it's a first novel and I had no clue, but they forgave the mistakes because they were emotionally attached to the characters. Do you know what I mean? I think if a book can make you cry, can move you to great emotion, you tend to remember it. And it became one of those books that people talked about. So it sold a lot of books and I couldn't believe it. I was like gobsmacked. But I still didn't tell people. I told nobody. My husband used to go mad because I remember meeting on we were having a walk with the kid, with the double-decker buggy because the 2 kids, and we were walking along the quay and I met this girl that I went to school with and I hadn't seen her in, 20 years. And so she was like, oh, how are you? And what are you doing? And I was like, oh, I'm a stay-at-home mum. And Rog was going, you are not. You're a published author. You're number 1 on Amazon. And don't tell her that. She might buy it. I was mortified, thinking if anyone knew I wrote them.
So going back to that first novel, do you want to tell us a little bit about it, the inspiration, where the ideas came from, so on?
I went to... see, this is now where I just get crazy to start talking nonsense. But I went to Florida and on my own, and I decided I'd write this book. So I had been writing it for about, say, 8 months, kind of weekends and evenings, and I decided to finish it. And so I went over, and my mum and dad were like, "What do you mean you want to write a book? And you can't go to Florida." Like, my dad was convinced someone was going to murder me over there, like I'd never be found again. But I was like, let's sit at 30, I can do this. So I went on my own and I literally lay by the pool and I had about 30,000 words to finish it. But I did it in the 2 weeks. And I remember coming home with a really nice tan and a finished novel. But the funny thing is when I wrote that when I was 30, I was single. So I didn't have children. And then, as I said to you, when Amelia was about 6 months old, I decided I would actively look for a publisher. I took it out from under the bed and I thought, well, let's have a look at it. And I kind of read it back and I thought, it's not bad. But I got the parenting side of it wrong because now I was a mother, okay? And I realised that a lot of the mother stuff that I'd written, Grace is the main character in it, but it was a little bit cheesy and a little bit cliche. And I thought, now that I'm a mother, I actually know what that is like. So I rewrote it, so it was probably right that I didn't try and do anything with it before I had children, because I rewrote it with a very different mindset.
And would you say Grace would be a favourite character of yours because of her being your first, or is there any other character of the 12 books so far that you would say is your favourite?
I always feel like that's like now, if I say to you now, tell me both of you now, which is your favourite child? And you're going to say Carmel. I think as well, like it is literally sometimes the most recent character you've kind of lived with becomes your favourite because they have very much been, and I have to say there are a few though that are kind of standouts. Grace, because she's one of the first, and a lot of my really good friends feel like that I would be like Grace. They felt when they read Grace's character, they thought that she was like me, and I think you can't help it that your DNA is a little bit kind of in all of the characters. I have a soft spot for Ruth in A Thousand Roads Home. And Ruth was inspired by a very dear friend, somebody very important in my life who is on the spectrum. And I had promised them that I would write a story with a lead character, not a side character, not the sidekick, not the funny side, but that a lead character would have autism. And so Ruth's character is very much a love letter to that person. So she's very special to me. And then also, I have to say, Greta in My Pear-Shaped Life, which is probably my quietest novel, only that it came out during lockdown, and so it kind of didn't really get a chance to. And I still sold quite a few books actually, but it just didn't really get a chance to have much mentions. But Greta feels like a little sister, because Greta has very, very poor self-image, and her story is very much one about learning to love yourself no matter what size you are, and that's a subject that's very close to my heart. So I always feel quite protective of her actually, and she kind of stays in my mind often. And then most recently in The Lighthouse Secret, Beth is 17, coming up to 18, and her story is very much a coming of age story. And while our lives are completely different, I really identified with her because when I was her age, like her, I really wanted to know what was on the other side of the horizon, and I really wanted to escape Wexford at the time and travel, and I did. And so she really, in The Lighthouse Secret, she really wants to leave Ballycotton, and she wants to travel the world, but the expectation is that she'll follow in her mother's footsteps and she will marry a lighthouse keeper, as her mother did, and become a lighthouse keeper's wife. And she's so desperate to live a life of excitement and travel. And she's really, really being pressured by her family not to do that. And I kind of understood that. So my parents didn't want me to marry a lighthouse keeper, but he very much had a kind of laid out my life, what it should look like. And it wasn't anything, I didn't want that. So I knew the wanderlust that Beth has is all mine. And so she feels quite special as well.
She was a really beautiful character. I think a lot of people could empathize with her because, as you say, like when you are that age, you kind of don't know what the path holds for you. And I think you're trying to figure out where you belong and where you should go. And if like the expectations, as you say, that people have for you are actually what you want for yourself. And we could see that kind of coming through with her. We were both very lucky enough to get a copy of the book sent out to us. Thank you very much for that. And we already said that we've attended the event in Cork. But for anyone who hasn't read it yet, could you give a general kind of gist about the book and what it's about?
Sure, I'd love to. Thank you. Well, it's a dual timeline set between 1951 in Ireland and the present day in both Ballycotton in East Cork, Ireland, and also Maine in New England in America. And it tells the stories of 4 lighthouse keepers' wives in 1951 who commit a crime, cover it up, and vow never to tell. And of course, because it's a novel, someone does tell. And 70 years later, the granddaughter of one of those lighthouse keepers' wives receives an anonymous note. And she's working, and she's a TV anchor actually for a breakfast show in America, in New England. And she receives an anonymous note saying, family secrets never stay buried. And this will ultimately bring her back to Ballycotton to find her grandmother, Beth, that I've just been talking about, to try and uncover what happened in 1951. So there's kind of 2 mysteries on the go. There's a mystery in the present day. Who is sending these anonymous letters, because they keep on coming, and why, to what end? And then there's the mystery in 1951, because you have to wait till the very end to find out what the crime was and why the crime was committed, and then the consequences of that crime. So yeah, so it's a kind of a suspenseful historical mystery, I think, with terms of loss and family. It's coming of age, finding your tribe and that sisterhood of the tribe, and the lengths you will kind of go to help each other. And then it's also then one of the other themes in it, as we've touched upon, is the kind of the pressure, the family pressure that Beth feels in 1951 to follow a particular path. And then the societal pressure that's still here for women today. And Beth's granddaughter, Molly, who's in her 30s, and she's a very successful TV anchor, and the pressure that she feels to start a family, and the societal pressure and family pressure that she feels to do that. So kind of it's teasing out that as well. So yeah, so that's The Lighthouse Secret.
It was fantastic. I have to say, like, I couldn't put it down to the point where I was picking it up in physical format at night time and then listening on audio as I was driving and doing jobs and everything. Like, I had to find out what happened. I did, and like I've passed it on to my mom, who just dropped it back to me today, and she said the same, that she was just hooked, couldn't get enough of it. Like, I'd ask her, where are you in the book, and she's like, oh my god, I'm here now, I can't wait to find out what's next. So yeah, it's a it's a brilliant book.
And I remember you telling the story about seeing the lighthouse and stuff at that event in Cork. And was there any kernel of an idea for the story previous to the lighthouse, or was it kind of seeing the lighthouse set all the rest of it kind of in motion?
Genuinely, there wasn't. Like, there really, really wasn't. I had just handed in a novel. And so we had, it was, you know, it was kind of the in-between moments. So it was a couple of months before I would have been starting the 1st of September new novel. So I always right this minute, I have about 4 ideas for different books. I know already what I'm going to start. Next year's book is written, and I'll do edits now over the next couple of months. On the 1st of September, I'll start 2026's novel, but I know what that is. I know 100% what I'm going to write. But I have ideas for 2027. I have 3 or 4 solid ideas, and I don't know which I'm going to go with. And I was in that situation. I had 3 or 4 solid ideas, and I wasn't sure which I was going to write. And I knew I was going to spend the summer mulling it over and thinking about what works. Then we went to Ballycotton, and I went with my 2 sister-in-laws who, well, we've dropped the in-laws. They're sisters now in every kind of way they should be. And they brought me there. And it was literally because I'd just been in the writing cave finishing this book. They organised the weekend, and I just said, tell me where to be and I'll be there. And I genuinely, it was literally the night before, and I put the sat nav on. I thought, where am I going? How long? When do I need to leave? And I was like, oh, it's only 2 hours away. It's grand. I knew it was Cork, but genuinely didn't know where in Cork. So when I arrived, I went without any kind of preconceived knowledge of it, and I was blown away. Just seeing, I think because the lighthouse is black, and there's so few black lighthouse towers in the world. Never mind, there's a couple in Ireland, actually, were very unusual, but there just aren't that many around. And that struck me initially. It was like, oh, and it's because it's on this little island that's so close to Ballycotton, you can see it very clearly. Even on a bad day, you can see it. So, it kind of just, it appealed to me. There's something there's something very mystical and romantic about lighthouses, isn't there? And they're kind of beacons of hope or something. So it appealed to my imagination immediately. But I genuinely didn't have any idea about the story until I took the tour to the lighthouse. And while we took the boat trip over to the lighthouse, by the time I came back, my mind had gone into a whole new place, and I had come up with this idea of this mystery and this secret, and I didn't know what I knew there were 4 women. I could see them in my mind's eye. I could see them standing on the pier, and I knew that they had done something, and they were very battered and bruised by what they had done, both physically and emotionally, but I didn't know what it was. And I didn't know that until I started to write it. Then I kind of tried to plot it out, but but I knew the shenanigans had happened. I knew that.
That's brilliant. I love just that the inspiration can be so instantaneous almost, especially when you had ideas kind of already brewing, obviously, about something else. And actually, out of curiosity, are any of those ideas that you had, are any of those the next book?
No, the next one actually, and I've just finished it. I've spent the last week actually in Tyrone Guthrie Centre. I don't know if you know of it or your listeners know of it, but it's a writer retreat. Well, it's actually an artist retreat, so it's not just for writers. So book 13 was handed in on Monday morning. But I'll tell you a tiny bit about it, and it is actually set between the 1960s and the present day. So there is still a little bit of a historical thread, which I always enjoy. And it centers around a child abduction in the 1980s and the kind of the far-reaching consequences of that. So a child is abducted in the 1980s, and 40 years later in the present day, a man walks into the life of that family whose child was abducted and says, I have a theory as to what happened to that child. And this will, of course, unravel so many secrets and lies and betrayal. Oh my God. It is very twisty, very twisty. And yeah, so I can't wait. I'll tell you more. Do you know what? When we're near the time, because I better not say any more, because I don't know what else I'm allowed to say, but I promise to tell you the inspiration for this one. I tell you again, right? So I promise to tell you more about it when I can. But the inspiration for it is a little bit kind of spine-tingly actually as well. Yeah.
Oh, that sounds fantastic. But also, when you said the 80s were 40 years ago, I actually had a moment where I was like, wait, what? That's not 40 years ago, even though that's like my age. I'm like, the 80s wasn't that long ago.
No, tell me about it.
But that sounds brilliant. But like, is there any particular era, be it time or setting, we'll say, that you've really enjoyed writing about, or you find yourself kind of gravitating towards?
So far, I've kind of stuck, the furthest I've gone back is the 1930s. And so far, I've kind of stuck to the timeline, those kind of timelines. And I think the reason I've done that so far is that there is somebody in my life that I can touch that has lived in those decades. I really enjoyed the 50s in particular, because my parents would have been kids in the 50s. And I found that really interesting. And, you know, to be able to ask them outright, well, tell me about this. And I kind of remember when I was doing a bit of research for the Lighthouse Secret, because it's all set in the 50s. And I was trying to understand what life was like in Ireland, in rural Ireland, kind of at the tail end. You know, we've just come out of World War II and rations and stuff like that. And it was quite an austere time. There wasn't a lot of money. And I kept reading about these potato pits and stuff like that. But I could go to my dad, and they just lived down the road to me. And I could go to dad and say, Daddy, tell me what, like, it's a potato pit. Oh, wait till I tell you now, Carmel. He could tell me. But I do think I would like to go further back at some point. I'm very interested in the echoes of my ancestors from hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And I would like to go further back. And actually, when I was researching The Girl From Donegal, which was the one before that, and that is set in Bermuda, as well as Donegal, as it does what it says on the tin, but it's Donegal and Bermuda. And the reason I chose Bermuda is because of the very strong Irish connections to that. So my Irish side of my family, when I was researching this, and I was kind of going, I started doing my DNA and doing my history. And I found out that my mum is English, my dad is Irish. And mum's family were the bosses from Bermuda, and dad's family were the slaves. And I have always wanted to write a book about my two grandmothers, actually, because as I said, my mum is from London and my dad is from Wexford. And my English grandmother, she fought in World War II. She was a navigational officer. And, you know, she was one of the few female navigational officers, right? She was like this stunning, like, we're already tall, but you should have seen her. She's beautiful, this beautiful tall woman. And she turned heads literally and lived this really fascinating life. And she ended up marrying a Royal Air Force pilot, my grandfather. And so she had it was an incredible life story, a really incredible life story. Meanwhile, here in Ireland, my Irish grandmother was in service. So she worked a life in service. You know, she was a maid in a big house, working. She was very much downstairs. So my English grandmother was upstairs. My Irish grandmother was downstairs. And I always thought it was really fascinating that my mum and dad met, because they shouldn't really have met. Their lives were very different, and they lived very, very different lives and came from very different worlds, and they met and fell in love, and they're together now nearly 60. Like, there's such a love story. So he said, like, oh yeah, write that book. That would be a bestseller. Write it. And my mother said, you will not write about my family. She's like, no, you're not writing anything. So I need to get my mum on board. My English grandmother, like, she shouldn't be alive, but in World War One, she was in London and her house was bombed, and her father had always told her where to go. And so she was in the house on her own. She was only 4 or 5, and she ended up going into like the cellar. And when her dad came, and he came looking for her, and he was looking through all the rubble, but she was okay. She had done what he'd said to do. And then my Irish grandmother, and she told me this, and it was literally, she would tell me stuff. She'd say, you get me to say stuff. But she was on her way home on a Sunday. She got to leave the house she was the maid in, and she'd cycle home to her family home to see everyone on a Sunday and bring them her wages, literally, you know, the way it was back then. And there was a siren in Wexford, but the siren went off, which meant that there were aircraft above, and there was a chance of bombs. And so you had to jump in the ditch. So she jumped in the ditch. And who did she end up in the ditch with but my grandfather? And she met my grandfather.
This is brilliant. Sure, no wonder you can write books. Like, your whole life has been a story. Like, how What a coincidence with all these things.
I know.
Would you ever consider writing a book about your own life, as in like a non-fiction, all the things that have come up through your writing? Because all of these stories, I could listen to these all day.
Would you think people would be interested? Oh my God,
Yeah.
I wouldn't even.
Like, did you see our jaws drop there? Like,
Wow. Okay. Well, maybe I might do get another 10, 15 years under my belt and then think about doing a memoir.
On the note of like the historical, do you find that it's really hard to strike a balance between the historical accuracy of your story and then the storytelling in itself?
Yeah, it is tricky, isn't it? I suppose what I have to remind myself the whole time is that it is fiction that I'm writing. I'm not writing a non-fiction book. So the most important thing is that I get the story told. But having said that, I do tie myself up in knots. When I was writing, you've read now The Lighthouse Secret, so I'll say this without any spoilers for anyone who might like to read it, who haven't picked it up. But I wanted to write the story that this thing that happens in 1951 to the four women, and this event that happens in their lives, I didn't want any of their husbands, or for Beth, her boyfriend, I didn't want them there. I wanted them all on the island, on the lighthouse, because I wanted it to be about that they were on their own. And the reason I chose 1951 was because there were no telephones and there was no radio contact. I wanted there to be that isolation. So when this terrible thing happens to them, they really there's this disconnect with the men in their lives, if you like. They have to solve it themselves to really kind of make that sisterhood jump out. But I was getting myself in knots about this flippin' rota for the men on the lighthouse, because trying to tie it in so that, they were all away at the right time when each part happened to the story. And I had to come up with this really complicated roster. And then I had to try and come up with a reason why they were all off at the same time, because there's these three. And I found like a retired lighthouse keeper who was a lighthouse keeper in Ballycotton. His name is Eddie, and like a fabulous man. So he gave me lots of information. And I was kind of going, oh, so I have to get this right, because there are going to be people who are going to read this who have lived this life. I cannot. So things like that, I lost days on that rota. I was going, no one would believe this, that I'm spending so much time on a flipping rota for these fictional characters. But I had to make it so that was genuinely the right thing. So I do work hard to be as accurate as I can. But I don't know if you ever read my author note, but I always say in the author note that any mistakes are mine, and I apologize, but this book is fiction, it isn't.
Yeah, I'd say that's hard.
That's a really good point, actually. Just about like what you just said there, where like obviously it's the story that's important, but the inaccuracies or something, if something jars someone, it's jarring them out of the story and out of the little bubble you've created within it. So that's a really good point, actually. Yeah.
Like even I wrote a scene there the other day, and it was like a little girl was wearing black patent shoes, and I went, God, were they there in the 1970s? And I had to go and I Googled that, and they were, but I made sure. And then I wanted a phone call to happen between two characters, and I was thinking, God, would she have a telephone in her house? And I Googled, and it was like 35% of residential homes in London had a phone in the 1970s. And I thought, well, she's poor, she's not got one, so she doesn't have a phone. She's the phone box. So stuff like that. I do try to make it accurate.
I just, even as readers, we could get wrapped up or go down these rabbit holes of details we come across in story and stuff. So I can only imagine what it's like when you're writing and you get so wrapped up and swept up in those aspects of it as well. Like, what book would you say has had like the biggest impact on you?
Do you know what? I've thought about this question before, and there are many I could choose, but I'm going to go back to when I was 4, and I'm going to go back to my first day of school. And what I can tell you is on my first day of school, I didn't want to go. I couldn't see the sense in school. And my older sister had already gone, and I wanted to stay home. I had one sister who's a year older, and then there's twins who are a year younger, and I wanted to stay at home with the twins. I was like, I just didn't want to go. So I was that child that was roaring and screaming and putting up a fuss. And I remember the teacher, her name was Mrs. Joyce, and she said to my mother, what is Carmel's thing? What's her jam? And Mum said, books, just books. And so Mrs. Joyce said to me, we're going to start today with storytelling. You get to choose the book. And I remember thinking, ooh, okay, this is a little bit something. So she brought me over to a bookshelf, and I remember looking, and I saw this book, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, right? And I had never heard of it, but I remember seeing it. And I picked it up and I thought, I want that one, please. So then Mum slipped away, but I remember Mrs. Joyce, she called everyone and she gathered everyone on the ground and she said to me, you can sit by my leg. And I remember leaning into her leg and I can still remember the warmth of it. She just was such a warm, beautiful teacher, actually. So I leant into her leg and she started reading Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And I was completely hooked. And literally she read 3 chapters and she said at the end of the 3 chapters, she said, you have to come in tomorrow if you want to find out what happens next. And at that moment, I realized the power that books have, because I was not worried about anything other than getting back to find out whether or not Charlie got the golden ticket. That's all I wanted to know. I just wanted, and I was so, like, when she read the story so beautifully, I literally was dancing with Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine as they were like, they had got together their money to buy Charlie a chocolate bar, but he didn't get it. And then when she opened it, and in those first 2, he doesn't get the golden ticket. And I was with him for every part of it. And then I found out afterwards, and there was this movie then came out and we got to see the movie, and I've been obsessed a little bit with Wonka for a while then, but I love Charlie and the Chocolate Factory because while it's not actually my favorite childhood book, I think it's the one that had the most impact on me, because I can remember going away going, okay, this is the world I want to be in. I want to be in a world with books. That's the world I want to be in.
That's so cool. And for you to be so young to have that kind of a realization too is fantastic.
Just in terms of kind of current reading, like what is the last book that kept you up at night?
Well, actually, you had mentioned that you might ask me that, and I went through all of the books that I've read recently, and I've read some great books, but the one that kept me up at night late is actually one that I read about a year ago, but I still think it's the last one that did, so I'm going to say, and that's Fairy Tale by Stephen King. And the reason why this is back to my early reading. It is literally a story about good versus evil. It is like an epic quest. I love stories that have, a wise older person, the Lord of the Rings, you've got I love these stories where you've got youth and wisdom kind of mingled together. So you have this bravery and you learn so much from your elders, and you've got that in this. So Charlie meets this older neighbour who's a recluse with a mystery behind him and goes on this really epic adventure, which brings him to a very dark world where there's a lot of evil, and it is really a good versus evil story. So I adored that, and I stayed up until ridiculous o'clock to finish it, just to find out what happened.
That's a good sign of a book, isn't it?
Yeah, and Stephen King is especially good at those evil, good stories, yeah. That would be very typical of him, yeah.
One question that I actually was thinking of earlier. So obviously you are a voracious writer and reader. Are you a member of a book club?
No. And I should be, shouldn't I? I'm not. No, I'm not. And I should be. And I once or twice I've said to some friends, some girlfriends around here, will we start a book club up? And it's never just kind of really taken off. And, we kind of all got busy, but I'm not. And I kind of do regret that. I go to visit book clubs a lot. I will always, it's one of my favorite things to do. And actually, do you know what I need to do? For every book, I always put a note out to my socials and say, book clubs, pitch me, and I'll pick one and I'll just go to it. And I've done that. I've done that for every book.
As you probably know from your besties, we finish all of our interviews with a quick fire round. Would you be up for doing quick fire questions?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's kind of an either or situation. You pick one of the two that the two options that we give you, and you can elaborate or you can just shout them back at us, whichever you would prefer.
Firstly, hardback or paperback?
Hardback.
Okay. Number 2, DNF or power through?
DNF. I'm used to power through, and I've stopped now. I do give it at least 4 or 5 chapters. I really, I get a chance to really get into it. But if I'm not gripped, I'll stop. I might go back to it again though, because sometimes you have to be in the right mood for a book. But no.
Very good. Number 3, do you read reviews? Yes or no?
Not often. Is that okay of an answer? I do, yes, occasionally, but not often. What I will do is, I will, about a month or 2 after a book has come out, I will just check the headlines and make sure that things have not, the the wheels have not fallen off the bike. And I would just, as long as my average is kind of over 4 out of 5, then I kind of I'll leave it. And thankfully, it's never happened that I've gone below 4. I'm actually okay with all of my books. They've all been 4 point something out of 5. So I might just do a quick scroll through then, but I try not to. And but I do read national reviews. If they're like newspaper reviews, I read those with my heart in my mouth. But what I will say is, if anyone's listening to this who has to deal with reviews, I had a very, very big lesson a couple of years ago. And it was actually, I had a national review from one of the newspapers, and it was actually for my pear-shaped life. And they didn't slate it or anything like that, but they didn't love it. It was kind of an okay review. And it was kind of written as very much an okay review. I was disappointed. It was during lockdown. And my God, this poor book didn't get a chance. And now its review in the paper hasn't been great. And then at the end of the year, that same newspaper, The Independent, and they had, they'd asked their reviewers to pick their favourite book of the year. And another reviewer, not the one who had reviewed it during the year, another reviewer chose My Pear-Shaped Life as her book of the year. And that to me was a lesson right there. So I had really been upset and had lost time and worried about this kind of review, which was only meh, it wasn't bad, but it wasn't great. And at the end of the day, that's how subjective reviews are. I might love something and you might not like it, but that doesn't mean I'm right and you're wrong. It just means we like different things.
Number 4, only read the first page of a book or just the last one?
Only read the first page, I suppose. Only read the first page. Never read the last before the first. No, the first page only. That's a hard one. Yeah, only the first.
Number 5, have an actor you don't really like play the lead in an adaptation of your book, or have an actor you love turned down
so it never gets made at all. So either it's somebody you don't like and it's made.
It does get made, just not your preferred person.
I'd take not my preferred person because they might surprise me. So yeah.
Number 6, would you rather be a librarian or own your own bookshop?
Oh, my own bookshop, please. With a cafe attached that sells really nice cake.
Yeah. The dream. Number 7, would you rather become the main character in your last book or meet them?
Oh, your questions are amazing. So would I rather become the last character in my last book or meet them? Oh, well, you haven't read my last book because I've just finished it. No, I want to meet them. I don't want to be them. Oh, they've had a fairly shocking life. No, I meet them, thank you very much, in that bookshop with cake and coffee. Yeah, a million, yeah.
Number 8, would you rather not read books for an entire year or only read bad books for 6 months?
Not read at all. Oh, sure, I'll have to read the bad ones then because I couldn't not read. No, I'll read the bad ones because I can always rewrite them.
Number 9, would you rather meet your favourite author or your favourite character?
Oh, ladies, honestly, I want to meet... I'm going to meet my favourite... I don't know what to say. My favourite author, I think. Oh my God, that's so tricky. My favourite author, Liane Moriarty and Kristen Hanna, and I refuse to be between the two. Equal love for both. Yes. So, yes, Liane Moriarty and Kristen Hanna, equal love for both. All her life. Oh my God, brilliant.
And the last one, and potentially the most difficult one, number 10, Hazel Gaynor or Catherine Ryan-Howard?
Get lost. I'm not answering that. No way. I'm not answering. I literally, that's like asking me between Amelia and listeners, do you know the cruelty of that question? Like, my two best friends are two authors. And when I call their names, I do it alphabetically. So I go Catherine Ryan-Howard, Hazel Gaynor, because C becomes before H. And I will literally never choose between the two. No way.
So, Carmel, thank you so much for joining us. It has been so lovely. Like, we're literally, I know this will be edited down, but we're on an hour and a half, and like, that's a long time to be taking out of anybody's schedule. So we really, really appreciate you giving us the time.
I really enjoyed it. Like, you were so easy to talk to. You're so easy to talk to. You know, it didn't feel like work, right? And great questions. Genuinely.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for listening to this edition of Another Chapter podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like and share to keep the book conversation going. Thank you to Helen Becerra for the graphics, Mark Neville for the mixing, and to each of our contributors. Music is Make It Work by All Good Folks.
Don't forget to follow along on Instagram at Another Chapter Podcast. We'll see you there.